Hello, friends. So good to meet you. Greetings from Macon and Warner Robins, Georgia, central part of the state, about an hour south of Atlanta, where I work and live. My wife does send her regrets, but we'll be back, I suspect. When you make new friends, you're glad to see them again. And it's been such a joy to see Steve again. Steve and I met, I think, about 25 years ago in Lynchburg, Virginia. I was a part of the Blue Ridge NRHS chapter, and Steve would come up, and we met, and I presented for a group of yours in the past. And years have gone by, and then one night I got a wonderful email from this guy saying, "Are you still around?" And I said, "I am, but I'm in Georgia now." So anyway, it's fun, isn't it? The best part of this hobby sometimes, I think, are the friendships we make, even though we come together around a love of trains. And we do share a love of trains, right? And so if you're like me, you probably occasionally have someone say to you, "Hey, you love trains. Where can I go to ride a train just for the fun of riding a train?" And if you think about that in terms of states, what state would you recommend? There are some obvious ones, right? Obviously, Colorado ranks up there on the list. There's my 21-year-old daughter and my rail fan buddy at the Durango and Silverton. Obviously, New Mexico with the amazing Cumbres and Toltec, phenomenal piece of railroad. So those are probably high on all of our lists. Coming back east a little bit, in Ohio, you might tell people about the Cuyahoga Valley Scenic or the Hocking Valley. There's my same little daughter, but a few years back, I tried to break her in early, and she has. If you swing over to my wife's home state of Pennsylvania, we all know there are some classic tourist railroads in Pennsylvania. This is what used to be the New Hope and Ivyland. Now it's just the New Hope Railroad. Great ride. We all know and love the East Broad Top, a phenomenal place. Obviously the Strasburg, which my father used to say is the granddaddy of all tourist railroads, and I think he was right about that. So that's obviously a place you'd recommend. I finally got to see this locomotive at the Western Maryland Scenic, and so Maryland, of course, has a great tourist train now. Dutch was just talking about your trip to Cass. I think Cass might be one of my favorite places on planet Earth. I've been there, I think, a dozen times in my lifetime. Never gets old. But also the Durbin and Greenbrier Valley, I think it's called. That's a nice little ride as well. Coming back closer to where we are, obviously Tennessee Valley in Chattanooga has a nice place to send people to ride trains. And then, of course, your own North Carolina, Great Smoky Mountains. I agree. It's a lovely place to watch trains, and there we are with the Santa Special. But my goal tonight is to convince you to make a trip a little farther south to Georgia, because unbeknownst to a lot of people, Georgia right now has a lot of trains you can ride, and some of them are terrific. And so I want to tell you about those now. Let me get this out of the way first. I'm a Presbyterian minister. I never lie. This is not a paid endorsement. I work for no one like you. I am just a hobbyist and a lifelong rail fan, and so I just like telling people about these places because, number one, it's where I live. Number two, I enjoy them myself, and like all of us in this room, it's just good to ride trains, right? And fun to tell people where to go to ride them. So that's my agenda. So I'm calling this a half dozen Georgia Peaches. Some places you can go in the Peach State, your neighbor to the southwest, to ride some great tourist trains. So here's the trip we're going to take in the next hour and 15 minutes. I'm going to tell you about 5 active tourist trains in the state. So that's 5 of the 6. And then I'm going to briefly tell you about 2 of our railroad museums because they meet our criteria of this program. They have operating trains that you can actually ride. They're short and small, so I'm considering them half a peach each. So that's how we get to half a dozen, 5 plus 1 plus a half plus a half. But we'll go all over the state, and I have no doubt that many of you have been to many of these before. I'm happy for you to chime in with your own experiences. And you may even need to correct me a little bit along the way as I tell you some of the history, but happy to make this journey. Okay, so here we go, half dozen Georgia Peaches. We're going to start in the north and work all our way south. The northernmost tourist train, of course, I bet you're familiar with it, probably ridden it, the Blue Ridge Scenic Railway. It's been around a number of years, and as the name implies, it is a very lovely little line. It is in extreme northern Georgia. In fact, the very last 300 feet of the Blue Ridge Scenic are in the state of Tennessee. Its terminus, the town is bisected by the state line, so at the very end, at lunch, halfway, you're actually changing states into Tennessee. But it's a lovely line. It's been around for many years. A group of North Georgia rail fans, in fact, some of them involved in the Atlanta NRA chapter that I'm a member of, were responsible for saving this line and getting the state involved so that the trackage could be rail banked when CSX wanted to offload the line.
Ralph, isn't this part of the L&N Hook and Eye?
We're getting there. Yep, absolutely. So it's anchored in Blue Ridge, Georgia. And this is the old L&N station right there in downtown Blue Ridge. Blue Ridge has become a kind of bourgeois hangout place for Atlantans. So they all go north now to the mountains, and you've probably heard of Helen, Georgia, Blue Ridge. Some of these communities have really become quite, as my dad used to say, swanky. And you can see the hotels and the brew pubs and all that around. My interest, of course, is the train that bisects the middle of town. Gorgeous little L&N station there that's been renovated, and this is the hub for the tourist train operations. Yes, the Blue Ridge Scenic operates on the last 20 miles of the original L&N main line that came south out of Tennessee to Atlanta. At some point, some of you will know this history better than I do, the L&N built a second line to the west, and that line became kind of a secondary route. But you can see in the 1944 timetable there that Blue Ridge, Curtis, Galloway, Kyle, all the way up to Copper Hill, Tennessee. This is the portion of that old L&N main that the tourist line operates on these days. So you can see how we're in the upper counties of the state. The train crews are provided by one of the Patriot Rail short lines, the Georgia Northwestern? Yes, Georgia Northwestern, which is a Patriot railroad. You probably know Patriot's got short lines all over the country, including this one in North Georgia, Georgia Northeastern. And so while the tourist train employees work for the actual passenger operation, the train crews and the power is provided by Patriot Rail. Patriot Rail's got a great little shop in Tate, Georgia, south of the tourist train. And this is their interchange with the CSX down in Marietta, just in North Atlanta. And so you can just see here that they're operating some pretty serious short line power. They've got a fleet of about a dozen locomotives. They move some pretty heavy freight in North Georgia. But this is way down at the south end of the old L&N main. The Blue Ridge Scenic operates, as I said, that north end. And so here's a close-up map. We start in Blue Ridge, and the old L&N main follows the Toccoa River all the way up to the state line to McKaysville, Georgia, which shares a municipality footprint with Copper Hill, Tennessee. I bet many of you have ridden some of Tennessee Valley's extension trains over in that eastern Tennessee Valley. They come down from the north to Copper Hill through the Hook and Eye. And so this is the same line, but on the other side of the state line. What I love about the Blue Ridge Scenic relative to Georgia is it's the one place in the state where you can ride trains 4 seasons of the year. So actually even get a little snow in the North Georgia mountains. And of course, beautiful falls, which the railroad takes heavy advantage of. And those trains tend to fill up pretty quickly. The Blue Ridge Scenic has a nice collection of passenger equipment, probably 16, 18 cars in all, so it's a pretty impressive fleet, and they've done, I think, a pretty good job rehabbing them. They're all, except for one, which I'll show you in a second, they're all painted in a very attractive paint scheme that obviously pays homage to the L&N roots of the line. Here's just a little sample of the fleet from my photography. So you can see they all tie nicely together. They're just about all streamlined cars, no heavyweights, and they've built 2 home-built kind of excursion cars out of boxcars. That's where my daughter and I tend to ride. I don't know about you, but I'm an open-air car kind of guy. I like to lean out and breathe the air and take the pictures. But it really is a nice fleet. And one nice little touch, I think, is they mark all these cars with the original owner, which I think is a kind of a cool thing to do, at least for us rail fans. I recognize the general public probably isn't tracking that, but for people like us. And so you can see this is just a little sampling of some of the places where these cars have come from. It's just like every tourist railroad you and I love. They have amassed equipment from anywhere they can find it, right? And so it's come from all over the country, including naturally some L&N cars, and that seems appropriate given the route. We were just talking earlier about this car because we think it has some history with your Greensboro, chapter. originally a Santa Fe car, and you would know much more about the history than I do, but this is the one car in the Blue Ridge fleet that they haven't painted, and I'm kind of glad. It's got that beautiful corrugated side to it and an old Santa Fe car. You can, I don't think I have a picture of it here, but down at the end you can see a Super Chief logo paying homage to the Santa Fe. There's that open air excursion car. I think they have 2 of these. They've got a couple of cabooses hanging around that they have sort of retrofitted for tourist work. And they have a nice little trio of first generation power that Patriot Rail has actually painted for the Blue Ridge Scenic. Now I'm a diesel guy, particularly a first generation diesel guy. I love to find out the lineage of these locomotives. I think it's remarkable that 75 years later these machines are still turning a wheel and still making money for somebody. I don't know if anybody at LaGrange ever anticipated that 75 years later their machines, maybe they did, I don't know. But so like many of you, I'm sure, when you find a good first generation motor, you're interested to know. This GP9 was built in '58 for the Grand Trunk and Western, so it's a long way from home in the North Georgia mountains. Rebuilt at some point, obviously, with a new cab and probably some new Eternals. Here's a New York Central, originally a GP9, but it got rebuilt at some point into what was called a GP10. Started with the Central, went to Penn Central, Conrail, and then Patriot Rail picked it up. And the 3 locomotives on the tourist operation, the one that hasn't yet been painted, still wears the Georgia Northeastern scheme, a lovely scheme, by the way, is this nickel plate, 1960, GP18. Obviously, it's been chop-nosed, but it came through the nickel plate to the N&W, all the way into, it made it onto the NS rosters, and now is the standby unit for tourist railroading in the Georgia mountains. So here we are in Blue Ridge, about to leave. As I said, the old L&N Main follows the river, and it lives up to its name. It's a scenic line, and particularly in the summer and fall, you travel through some nice touristy areas as the line meanders along the riverway. Just some sampling of photography here, and when you put them all together, it's a pretty respectable train. They move some serious tourists through North Georgia, and I've been really pleased with what they're doing up there. Just a couple more samplings here on the way from Blue Ridge up to the Tennessee state line. Perhaps the highlight of the trip is crossing the Toccoa River on this ancient L&N through truss bridge that honestly looks like it might fall down at any minute, but I'm sure it's safe. But it certainly is a picturesque spot with that great stone abutment. And then once you're across the river, you're at the state line, and the railroad curves its way into Copper Hill, Tennessee. Coming back south, here's a couple aerial shots of that same bridge. Very lovely pastoral setting. And heading back south on the way home. Now, by day, I'm a Presbyterian minister, and when you go to the church I serve, it means as an extracurricular activity, you get to ride trains. So once a year, I take my congregation on a train trip, and so last year, we did the Blue Ridge Scenic, and that's my flyer I gave them, and you can see me, the shepherd, leading the flock to board the train, and my folks getting on board. We had a heck of a great time. And I even made a fake L&N timetable for them with the lyrics to Life is Like a Mountain Railroad, the old gospel hymn from the 1890s. And we had a great time. There's the inside of my timetable so that they would know where they were going. It was a lot of fun. Here's my Presbyterians. So I don't know how good of evangelist I am for Jesus, but I'm a pretty good evangelist for tourist trains. So we'll let Jesus shake that out in the end. So that's the Blue Ridge Scenic. Beautiful ride. And not too far from here, really. Not too difficult to get to.
Really,
And
it's just south of Murphy, which is the end of the...
Exactly.
If the Great Smoky Mountain Railroad was allowed to continue beyond, it would end up in Murphy. And Murphy is what, 20 miles from Blue Ridge?
Oh, not even that. Yeah, maybe 20. Right when you leave Blue Ridge and come to the river, the Murphy line splits off. The switch is still in, and the track goes a couple miles before it peters out in the woods. And then the right-of-way is pretty overgrown after that.
So it's 5 hours and 15 minutes from here.
There you go. Great. So,
I have a question for Donald, since he's joining us today. Are you responsible for the section between Andrews and Murphy or not?
No,
Okay.
that's the rail division.
Rail division, okay. Thank you.
So we're not considered the zone, but
Yeah, it would. Be
that's-
great.
yeah.
Be great.
We ride motor cars from Andrews down to Dillsboro and back.
Yeah,
So that's
good.
a 2-day trip.
By the way, in Ellijay, which is a tiny little community near Blue Ridge, there's a nice little model railroad club. And they're in the original L&N depot at Ellijay, which is like an 1895 structure or something. They've rehabbed it, and they're a really nice group. I don't have pictures of them. They're on my website, but I was pleased to discover them out in the middle of nowhere. All right, so that was the Blue Ridge Scenic. I'm kind of moving us along through this trip because I want to make sure we have time for all of it. Let's go a little farther south to Greater Atlanta, to the Stone Mountain Scenic Railway. Again, our category tonight is tourist trains you can ride in the Peach State, so we have to include the Stone Mountain Park in this. How many of you have ever been to Stone Mountain over the years? Yeah, great. Kind of an interesting place. Obviously, the center attraction is the somewhat controversial mural carved into the side of that giant mountain east of downtown Atlanta. But for us and our purposes, we're interested in the railroad, which circumnavigates the mountain in a kind of an oblong shape, with the park, which has really grown over the years, sort of spread out around the railroad. In the 60s, this was primarily developed as a tourist railroad, and only later has the park grown around it, and really the railroad now is just one part of many features of the very large Stone Mountain structure. As the train circles the mountain, the trail that takes you up to the top crosses, and that's what this is here. Those people are coming off the Stone Mountain Trail. If you've hiked that trail and were not winded at the top, this was your view. There's my beloved wife, Deborah. And downtown Atlanta is right in the middle of the photo, if you can just make out the tops of the skyscrapers. So you really get a 360 view of the metro area there. You're too far south to really appreciate the Blue Ridge Mountains from this vantage point, but it's still kind of a neat place to go and appreciate the Atlanta smog. So there's that. But we're interested in trains, not hiking. The tourist train takes you, as I said, around the mountain on a continuous loop, and when it comes back around, you do get a pretty darn spectacular view of the carving. Everything good? Yeah.
Well,
We good?
No, I was just gonna say, we've got some guests, and I believe that we met you earlier today.
Yeah,
Oh, great. Yes, we met you in the ice cream shop. I'm so glad you came.
Yeah, we were trying to figure out if you were a doctor or
I'm retired.
Retired.
yeah,
I'm a farmer now, so a rancher.
okay.
I'm a rancher.
A rancher.
We are delighted.
So glad you came. We are talking about tourist trains in Georgia.
Right.
So some trips you can take from here
Thanks.
to there. And we're only one in, so you haven't missed much. So glad you made it. As I was saying, when you come back around the front side of the mountain, you do get a pretty spectacular view of the carving. But honestly, I think prettier than the carving is the train. They've done a fantastic job painting up this current offering of the Stone Mountain. And I say that because it's had many iterations over the years. But I think it's a just darn beautiful paint scheme. We're going to talk about these locomotives in a minute. Many of you will remember the New Georgia operations that ran in Atlanta in the 80s. Dutch was saying earlier he rode the New Georgia back in the day, with some also beautiful equipment in that gorgeous Central of Georgia inspired scheme. They would run trips from downtown Atlanta out to Stone Mountain because the loop around the mountain was physically connected to the rail network, and so the New Georgia trains could go out there, switch onto the loop, make a loop, and then come back into town. That was a very popular dinner train for a while. They even ran some steam. ANWP 290, I think, was used for a while, maybe 750 as well. Some of the steam engines we all know and love made these trips. New Georgia petered out, though, when the state pulled its funding years and years ago. And then CSX pulled the rail connection. So now the Stone Mountain Scenic is an isolated loop of track, and these locomotives and equipment we'll see more of in just a second are there in perpetuity unless they're trucked out on a lowboy. In the 60s, when the Stone Mountain Scenic started, they had some interesting motive power, including two 440 American types, this being one of them. The kind of kitschy tourist draw in the 60s was to celebrate the 100 years of the Civil War, right? And so they dressed these locomotives up to sort of look like Civil War engines, not really, but kind of. This was the first scheme, Stone Mountain Scenic Railway. That's a genuine brochure from the late 60s.
It's a great locomotive chase, right?
They were sort of playing on the Great Locomotive Chase, although it was actually the Great Locomotive Loop, because all they did was just go around the mountain. And as one observer noted in something I read, rather than it was Civil War themed, but they always got attacked by Native American Indians, and it's sort of that kitschy way tourist railroads like to do. But this is from a 1966 tourist train guy, but isn't that a great photo? What a beautiful photo that is of the train coming around the loop. And you can see it was quite an extensive thing. It had no less than 3 coaches and a combine behind an American type, and I just think that's a pretty impressive selling point. Here's a postcard from the 60s. They named, to Dutch's point, they named the locomotives the General II and the Texas II, right? The 2 locomotives that were in the Great Locomotive Chase.
This particular configuration engine was the workhorse for the North Carolina Railroad here in between 1860 and 1895.
Right.
I don't know, how old was that engine?
These engines were turn of the century 1910 Baldwins that got kind of backdated to make them look a little-ish kind of.
440 was our workhorse.
But they were genuine 440s, yeah, absolutely. Here's a black and white from that era, in the first 5 or 6 years of the tourist operation, and they were very popular. Now here's what the General II looked like before it became the General II. The top picture is life on the Louisiana Eastern, which is a whole other story I could tell you, except we don't have time. But a fascinating story about a man named Pence in Louisiana who started collecting steam locomotives in the late 50s and early 60s, including this one. He had dreams of running a freight short line with only steam, but that was never going to happen in the late 60s. So when he died, his family had this massive collection of aging kettles in South Louisiana. They all got sold off, and that's how the Stone Mountain Scenic picked up 2 of his locomotives, including this one. And so you can see it's a very high-stepping American, good-looking engine that they sort of backdated to give it a little bit of a Civil War kind of feel. You can see the stack and the headlight, and the fake wood piled up in the tinder, all those kinds of things. I'm really proud of this photo, not because it's necessarily a great photo, but because my father took it in 1958 when he visited Louisiana Eastern. This is the same locomotive, just a few years before it wound up coming to Georgia to work on the Stone Mountain Scenic. And here's the General II today in the Southeastern Railway Museum in Duluth, which I'll show you momentarily. So this locomotive survives. You can see a lot of its appliances and pieces are gone at this point, but it lives on, and you can see the kind of fake Civil War cow catcher that was made for the front of it and all those sorts of things. By the way, speaking of steam engines, there is a local connection that you all have to the Stone Mountain Scenic. Anybody know what it is? I was hoping somebody would know. This locomotive, does it look familiar?
Oh, yeah.
Clemens? Tanglewood Park. This locomotive was at Spencer for years, right? Dressed in a Southern paint scheme. This locomotive never worked for the Southern. Anybody know the history of this engine? It's painted Southern, but it wasn't a Southern engine.
Maybe Illinois Central?
Illinois Central. It was part of that amazing fleet of heavy switchers that the Illinois Central had. How it got to Spencer is a long and interesting story, which I don't have time for tonight. But before it made it to Spencer, via a couple of other places in industrial work, it would briefly serve the Stone Mountain Scenic as motive power. Can you believe that? And it doesn't surprise me that after a season or 2 of running an 080 in tourist service, they were like, yep, nope, this isn't any good, and on it went. My experience of heavy switchers is they're not smooth running locomotives, and I'm sure in the tourist work that was no interesting. But as we said, this locomotive is now in Clemens, and of all things has a connection to Stone Mountain Scenic. And before it got there, this is the same engine with the DeBartle-DeBim Coal Company in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. So it came off the IC, was into coal service, went to Stone Mountain, went a couple of other places in industrial work, landed at Spencer at the museum, then Spencer, I think, gave it or sold it. What's the story there? They swapped
They swapped it,
for,
and the Winston-Salem chapter paid for the transfer.
There you go.
Cost to get 542 out of Tanglewood, and they.
they swapped it for that. Yeah, yeah, great, whatever.
Was this one of your father's photographs?
No, that's out of a book.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. Although he did visit this coal operation, Tuscaloosa, in the 60s and shot some photos, but not this locomotive. Yeah. But back to modern day and these beautiful F units. As I said, just a lovely, lovely paint scheme. If you can see the emblem on the front, it says the Rock Line, which I think is kind of catchy and fun, and really pleased at how these turned out. This and its sister are Southern Railway locomotives, and I know we've probably got a lot of Southern Railway fans in the room, like myself. I'm a lifelong Southern guy in terms of interest. So here's the 6143 as you'd see it today. Here's what it looked like working for the old man, for the Southern Railway. Nice to know that this guy is still running. So is its sister, the 6147. So they have 2 F units at the Stone Mountain, and here's what she looked like in Atlanta at the Southern Shops, not too long before the NS merger. That's not my photo, but I know that spot. Here's a couple of other shots of this. Oh, sorry, the 6147 is the second unit with sister unit there in front, but you get the idea. Here's a couple of other images.
Those were the engines they ran on the Piedmont.
So these were 2 of the 4 locomotives that wound up in the excursion program, right? Running excursion trains as the diesel backup power. I don't know what happened to the other 2. Some of you in the room probably would know where they landed, but 2 of them are at Stone Mountain Scenic. Here's the 6147. 3 of these photos are actual Southern Railway service. This one's excursion service. You can see the steam locomotive smoke behind it. That's my photo as a kid in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, halfway through a 750 excursion. So she's been around, this locomotive, and now is enjoying retirement, making loops around Georgia's biggest hunk of rock. All right, so that's the Stone Mountain Scenic. Oh, actually, a couple more photos. They do have a great Seaboard Coastline caboose that they tow around. They have their home-built cars and with nice wide open spaces, so you get a nice view of the Civil War generals as they ride off into infamy. All right? Staying in Atlanta, let's make a quick visit to the Southeastern Railway Museum. Any of you ever made a stop there over the years? Well, then good. I want you to, because it's a nice collection. I'm a member of the Atlanta chapter. The Atlanta chapter kind of underwrites this museum, although it's pretty much its own enterprise at this point as a nonprofit. But nevertheless, the histories are interwoven. It's really a great museum, and I tell you what I like about it. It's not necessarily the prettiest museum, and they don't necessarily have the biggest collection, but it is all very genuine Southeastern. In other words, they've done a good job of selecting pieces and locomotives that represent the region. And so I hope you will think about making a stop there. There's some things worth seeing. There's the physical plant. That is the Duluth Southern Railway Station that has been moved to this spot and preserved, a kind of classic Southern Railway depot. The museum is behind the depot that way, and the southern main from Atlanta into the Carolinas is to your right. Still a very, very busy main line, obviously sees the Crescent twice a day and plenty of NS traffic. Here's the overview of the museum. This is my shot from a drone. This is the second site this museum has been on in northeastern Atlanta. This was a rail car facility. They built rail cars here. And turns out rail car construction facilities make great railroad museums because you've got all this track and sheet metal coverings. And so it's served, it's not the prettiest home for a museum, but it sure is functional. And you can see there's a ton of equipment spread out all throughout these buildings. And there's even another track not in this photo that follows the tree line down to a second facility. As I said, we're right next to the busy NS main, and so any hour you're at the museum, trains are zipping by frequently. I was there 2 years ago and caught the Savannah Atlanta unit in a distributed power lash up, so that was kind of fun. I hadn't seen that one before. There's some nice things. Let me just give you a quick little taste of the collection because I want to get us on to tourist railroading. but there are some Central Georgia wooden cabooses. Savannah and Atlanta 750 lives here at the Duluth Museum. You know 750 from excursion years on the Southern Railway, a classic, gorgeous Pacific. Mr. Flagler's locomotive, as I like to call it, Henry Flagler, who built down into Key West and bought these Pacifics to run tourists down to the end of the island there. After those years of high-speed running, it came up to the Savannah, Atlanta, and then the Atlanta chapter scooped her up after the S&A was absorbed into the Southern, and she spent many years in excursion service. She was sort of, as the old expression goes, rode hard and put up wet, as they say about horses and saddles. So it would take a lot to get her running again, but cosmetically she's in great shape. The Duluth chapter is her home. They also have the Chattahoochee Valley 21. The Chattahoochee Valley was a great little short line on the Atlanta-Georgia state line. 21 served that short line for years. It was a little paper mill short line that interchanged with the West Point route. This locomotive lives on at the museum, and my father rode the last trip behind 21 when the Atlanta chapter in 1961 did an excursion on the Chattahoochee Valley. There's my dad's ticket, and my dad took all of these photos, and his friend Pard Lively drove up from Pensacola to ride behind 21 for the last trip she would ever make under steam before being donated to the Duluth Museum. I've also got some nice diesels. As far as I'm concerned, the Georgia Railroad had some of the prettiest road switchers around, beautiful blue and white. The Duluth Museum has one of only 4 remaining Southern E8s and one of only 2 that run. And so that's a kind of a prized piece in the collection if you're a Southern Railway fan. This locomotive still operates under its own power, used, of course, in the Crescent, famously. I grew up just outside of New Orleans, so I'm emotionally invested in the Crescent, which I understand just turned 100 last week, right? The first running of the Southern's Crescent, I think, was 100 years ago. And so there's the Lake Pontchartrain Bridge just north of New Orleans that I grew up watching trains on. So it's a beautiful locomotive. SD 45-2. They have 2 interesting cars in their collection. This is the Superb, a Pullman built in 1911. Do you know who that guy in the photo is? Historians among us?
Edison.
Nope.
Flagler.
Nope. Warren Harding,
Right.
one of your presidents. This was his car, and it now belongs to the Duluth Museum.
One that he passed in?
I believe it is.
Okay.
And as a Presbyterian minister, I shouldn't say things like this, but Harding apparently was known as quite the ladies' man. So who knows how he died in the Superb? I don't know, but we'll leave that to historians. It's a lovely car, and it's a prized part of the collection. Recently, this car was added to the Duluth collection, though. Do y'all know what this is? This is the Marco Polo. It's an old NS man. You should know what this car is. This car was used by...
Oh,
This was Roosevelt's car, the Marco Polo. And it still belongs to Norfolk Southern. It's on a long-term loan to the Duluth Museum. This car sat in Washington, D.C. for about 25 years, and the Southern and the NS after them used it to charm dignitaries and entertain. It sat at Union Station down on that far side track when you go down on the platforms, and rarely moved. You can see it's even sublettered for Norfolk Southern. It is a gorgeous piece of equipment. I've had the privilege of going through it. They only open it up on special occasions. Norfolk Southern said to the Duluth Museum, you can use it, you have to air condition it. So they don't open it up very much because it's in pristine shape on the inside and has to be well maintained, and I understand
that. Was that used for the Roosevelt funeral train?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that question. Yeah, Southern did handle that train, but I don't know what the rolling stock was.
I'd like to read an article sometime, because we just had I hope we haven't seen the last president, who dies and gets a funeral.
I had my fingers crossed for Jimmy.
Yeah.
They didn't do it.
Didn't do it.
And that should have been the place too, because one of the places that when I'm going to take you in about 15 minutes is Plains, Georgia, which still has rail service, but they didn't do a funeral train for him.
FDR's train, I think, it was a much longer trip and got tremendous number of people watching it from Warm Springs to
If you go to Barnesville, Georgia, about 45 minutes from where I live, the Central of Georgia main comes through Barnesville. It's where the Nancy Hanks used to run. And if you turn your back on the Central of Georgia Depot, there is a gorgeous mural on the side of a building, and FDR is there, and the Southern Railway Pacific is behind him, and it's his funeral train. I mean, he's remembered alive, but the train depicted it was his funeral train. So very cool. So that's a neat piece in the collection there. But our topic tonight is trains you can ride. You can ride a train at the Duluth Museum. It's short and small and dinky, but it runs. They have a great little General Electric industrial switcher that somebody gave them years ago. They keep it running. They put a 2-car caboose train together, and by golly, you can ride a train at the Duluth Museum. They come out of the museum, they come out to the derail at the NS Main, and then they back up down this far side track, down into the woods to their second shop. They go out and back, and that's it, $5. Not necessarily exciting for us in this room, but I do say it's a great place to take your kids and your grandkids. This is the perfect kind of train for little kids, right? Whose attention spans are short. You know what I mean? They can't do those all-day excursions like we love. This is perfect. And actually, the museum has a full-time staff, and they actually do a great job with children's programming. So I'm kind of not kidding about that. If you have grandkids and you ever come to Atlanta, let me know. I'll hook you up. It's a fun place to take kids. As I said, the ride kind of takes you down into the woods to a secondary shop where the museum does all its renovations, namely this place. And if you know ANWP 290, that big heavy Pacific that for a little while did excursion work in the 80s, it lives back in this in pieces. I don't know if she'll ever run again, but that's that part of the museum.
You got a wreck train too.
You got a heavy derrick. Yeah, or not a heavy derrick, but a pretty good size wreck train there. They have a really handsome N&W caboose, a Southern Railway transfer caboose, and for an extra couple bucks, you can even ride in the cab if it's center cab GE. And so that's kind of fun. So that's the museum in Duluth. Really much worth a stop. I hope if you're next time you're down in Atlanta, take a pass through there and see the equipment. Let me take you to a second museum in Georgia where you can also ride a train, but also has a nice little connection. Anybody ever been to the Georgia State Railway Museum in Savannah? Yeah, okay, one of you. Also a nice place and worth a stop next time you're down on the coast.
Very worth a stop.
So, of course, Savannah's a terrific town to visit, in my opinion. Go down on the riverfront, eat too much seafood, and have a great time in a great city that reminds me a lot of my home, New Orleans, a very similar character. But for us rail fans, do go to the Georgia State Rail Museum, which is located at the Central of Georgia shops. Honestly, one of the oldest railroad facilities you can visit in the country. This place dates back to not long after the Civil War, and they have rehabbed a lot of the buildings. And it's a railroad museum where you'll enjoy seeing the trains, but you'll find the buildings almost as interesting because there's just a ton of history there. Especially the roundhouse, which I've got pictures of. Here's a Central of Georgia map from the 40s. Savannah was, of course, home base for the Central, and everything went west from there over to my city of Macon here, where they spread out into 5 or 6 different main lines that went across Georgia, some of them into Alabama. Central of Georgia like to say they were the right hand of Southeastern Railroading, 5 lines spreading out from Savannah and Macon. That was part of their advertising bit. 2,000 miles in total. 1,300 of which were all in the state of Georgia. So Savannah was a big deal for the Central, and the museum is anchored in the old company shops. This is the old blacksmith building, which they have rehabilitated and put a lot of turn-of-the-century equipment in that you can see. This is the old car and paint shop for the Central, where they would rehab their freight and passenger fleet. But, as my friend has already said, the highlight of the grounds is the roundhouse and turntable, which are all in use. Operating turntable, similar in size to the one at Tennessee Valley in Chattanooga, and they demonstrate it for crowds, and it's a lot of fun. And they've got a pretty decent little equipment collection, mostly rolling stock, but some locomotives. Most of which have a connection to the Savannah area. Let me just give you a couple little highlights. That upper left wooden coach is thought to be the oldest surviving Central of Georgia piece of equipment anywhere. 1890s, I think, so it's old. And they have saved that car, and that's pretty cool. I love the old Seaboard Airlines Silver Meteor scheme. My dad had a couple of O-scale freight cars that he had decaled in that scheme, so that brings back happy memories for them. They've got one of those. That ubiquitous Seaboard coastline caboose style, they've got one of those. And to my delight, as a Southern Railway fan, they have a early Southern Bay window. This is a good moment for me to say that one of my projects with my website in the last 3 or 4 years, I just woke up one morning and decided, you know, I don't have enough to do in my life. I'm going to try to visit and document every surviving Southern Railway bay window caboose. Why not? My father loved them. He built a couple of O-scale scratch-built bay window cabooses when I was growing up. I grew up, I cut my rail fanning teeth on the Southern down in New Orleans, and there was always a red bay window on the end of every freight train, obviously until the early 80s. And so I just decided a lot of these have survived. Let's document them. So I've set out to do that. These are, by the way, all the ones I have collected in North Carolina and parts of South Carolina. So there's a nice sampling there from your own state. Here are all of the ones that are surviving in Georgia in quick review. And here are my statistics. I'm tracking 183 of them. I have gotten confirmation from authoritative voices that 166 of them are known. In other words, I'm quite sure about where they are. And I have up to today documented 118. I got 3 on the way here to see you. And so I've got 67% of them photographed. I know, I'm such an, I need a.
You have the one in Greensboro?
I do, yeah. Oh, Greensboro. I need to talk to you about that one. I'm not sure I have that one.
It's at the Pomona Yard. It's behind the tower.
I do not have that one. You'll have to help me with that one.
I'm trying to acquire it.
Very good. Keep me posted, because I'll need to get that one in my collection. Anyway, it's just been a fun little project. They were, of course, a unique specimen of caboose, right, in American railroading. The Southern settled early on in that bay window design. They had other kinds of cabooses, of course. You all know this history as well, or better than I do. But that bay window sure became the symbol of Southern Railway modern freight. And you can see, by the way, you're number 2 in the rankings. Georgia has the most, 45, but you've got, as far as I know, 31 here in North Carolina, Alabama, Tennessee, and then they kind of sprinkled out, even in places where the Southern never even got close, like Pennsylvania and Iowa. There are 5 Southern Railway bay windows in Iowa. Go figure, right? So that's a side note, but I thought you all would appreciate that. And I'll keep you posted. When I get to 166, we'll have a party. Yeah, I'll invite you. Yep. All right, back to Savannah. Great facility. Just real quick, some locomotives. They've got Old Maud, which was the Central's shop switcher in Macon for years. Kind of a famous locomotive among rail fans. What a beast that thing is, huh? Can you imagine them chugging that around the yard? They've got a early 1939 SW1. If you know anything about EMD products, that's early for EMD. This was a genuine #1 on the Central roster. Then it went to work. Here's my dad's photograph in the 60s out at Stone Mountain, not at the park, but at a limestone quarry out there. They've got a genuine 1965 Jeep 35 that actually was sublettered for the Savannah and Atlanta, not for the Southern. Even though it wore a Southern paint scheme, they lettered it for subsidiary S&A. Here's what she looked like later in a Southern scheme after the Central of Georgia had absorbed the Savannah, Atlanta. You can see she's sublettered for the C of G. They have what I think might be one of the prettiest little steam locomotives I've seen in a long time, and that is Central of Georgia 223. Just a lovely 1907 Baldwin consolidation. This locomotive worked for the Central in mainline service and then went to the Wiggle and Twist, the Wrightsville and Tinnell, which is a classic Georgia short line that some of you know about from your own reading. They called it the Wiggle and Twist because it was 60-pound rail that wiggled its way between its namesake cities. And then it was given to the city of Columbus, Georgia. It sat out and rusted for years, as these old kettles sometimes do, before the museum got a hold of her. And as you can see, they have cosmetically restored it, and it is a lovely, lovely locomotive. Look at those spoke drivers. That strums a man's heart, as far as I'm concerned, if you're a rail fan like me, and I know you are. And so that's a really cool part. All right, let's finish up in Savannah, though, so we don't run out of time. What they have that runs is a classic GE 44 tonner. And this, interestingly enough, the one item that runs is not from the South. This locomotive started up in New England somewhere, or came from a short line up in New England. Prior to that, though, it worked for the American citizens, because it was a part of the Army's United States Transportation Corps fleet, and worked for the Army for years, and then for the Air Force before a short line bought it, and now the museum has it. They've replaced the prime mover, but she runs, and her job now in retirement is hauling happy tourists in Savannah. And so they've built a home-built coach there at the museum, one car, and every hour on the hour they run their little trip. They take you out onto the turntable, rotate you 360 degrees, and then you go down a spur about maybe a quarter of a mile, a little less. They take you inside the old paint building, and then they bring you right back. So it's something, and it counts as a genuine tourist train. And as you can see, folks show up for the museum. Here's a great shot with a classic Georgia railroad crossing sign from the 20th century.
They need the skull and bones from the.
They do. They do.
Illinois Central there.
Here it is making its way around the museum grounds. As I said, they push you into the old Central of Georgia paint shop. By the way, some spare 44-ton trucks there, if you're a diesel guy like me. And then you go back, and that's the Savannah Museum. So, a nice place to visit. So if you're down that way, promise me, stop in, give yourself about 2 hours. It's worth the stop. A lot of railroad history there. All right? So those are our two museums. Again, I'm counting them as half a peach each, because although they have operating equipment, the rides are very short. But the Blue Ridge Scenic is a legitimate tourist ride, and I think the Stone Mountain Scenic reaches that classification as well, even though its ride is very brief. But let's go back to a very genuine tourist train that's been around for a number of years in Georgia. Any of you ever ridden the Sam Short Line? Oh, we do have to get you guys to Georgia. Enough hands aren't going up. Yeah, the Sam Short Line is great. It is sort of south-central Georgia, about probably 2.5 hours south of Atlanta. It's anchored in Cordele, which is right on I-75, easy to get to. It's
a great railroad town.
I'm gonna tell you about it in just a minute. It's almost like I paid Dutch to grease the works here a little bit.
I can't shut up.
I'm kidding. I'm just kidding. Here's a typical Sam Short Line train. Really kind of like the Blue Ridge Scenic. Really an impressive train. You can see there 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 cars, right? Sometimes they'll do push-pull, a locomotive on either end. Sometimes they'll do 2 locomotives. I don't know. I've seen them do all kinds of things. The Sam Short Line tourist train is hosted by the HOG, which I think has the best railroad acronym of any railroad in the country. HOG stands for Heart of Georgia, and yes, that's what the FRA gave them as a moniker when they signed up years ago. The HOG was for many years an independent short line in Georgia, but like so many short lines all over the country, and particularly in the Southeast, has now been absorbed into the Genesee and Wyoming Orange Empire, as many people call it. Although I'm not a cynic about Genesee and Wyoming, I'd rather see short lines run than abandoned. So I give Genesee and Wyoming credit where they're due. To their credit, they took the HOG emblem from the independents and incorporated it in their short line logo, which I think is kind of cool. Here's what the HOG looks like in terms of freight operation. They tie into the NS over on the old Central of Georgia, Maine in Midville. They come down to Vidalia and meet another Genesee and Wyoming short line, the Georgia Central. And then they swing due west from Vidalia all the way over to Cordele, which you can see is right on I-75. If you go straight up the screen beyond Macon, you're in Atlanta. Out of Cordele, they go over to Americus. And the right-of-way exists all the way over to Mart, Alabama, but the line is pretty much abandoned after Preston at this point. There were dreams, Genesee and Wyoming had dreams for the HOG to actually be an inland port for Savannah. They wanted to pull stack packs, containers, and piggybacks all the way over here to Cordele, and they even built a transload facility in Cordele for I-75. Makes a lot of sense, but for reasons well above my pay grade, it all fell apart. and that whole facility is just sitting there. And the Hog these days is an active short line, but probably not as active as the G&W folks maybe hoped it would have been. Side note, if you're a short line guy like I am, southwestern Georgia is Genesee and Wyoming country. They have about 8 or 9 short lines that they've all tied together into really a network. They're all kind of operated as a giant network, but they're all subsidiaries, right? They all have their own names, like the Hilton in Albany. You're familiar, no doubt, with the old Bay Line, the Georgia Southwestern, the Georgia Central, and in the middle, the Hog. The Sam Short Line operates on a piece of railroad that originally was a Seaboard Airline Maine. We think about the Seaboard Airline as a north-south railroad, right, along with the Atlantic coastline. But they had some significant lines west as well, and one of them left Savannah and went due west all the way across the state of Georgia as far as Montgomery. And so here you can see a 1909 official guide timetable. You can see we're starting at Savannah in the top, and we're going all the way down to Montgomery, which is off the screen. But you can see by the time you are past across the state of Georgia, you've gone 250 something miles on the Seaboard Airline. And so it was a pretty serious piece of railroad. The part in orange is where the Sam Short Line operates today. Incidentally, trackage owned by the state of Georgia. I will say this. I think North Carolina sets the bar in terms of state-sponsored passenger service. Wish Georgia would take a page out of your notebook and start running some regional middle ground trains. But they've done a good job in Georgia rail banking right-of-ways for reuse in either short line service or, in this case, tourist service. And so one of the reasons the SAM, the Blue Ridge Scenic, and the last railroad I'll tell you about at the end exist is because the state is happy to help to promote tourism, and therefore they make it easy from a regulatory point of view to run tourist trains. Any of the short line spinoffs from the NS, no offense to your former employee, no tourist trains. NS will have nothing to do with it. And so it's a no-go there. But the state of Georgia has made it possible for passenger trains to run. If you were to go back 130 years and ride the SAM, you'd have been in the care of this fine locomotive. Notice the lettering. SAM, short line. So the tourist road hasn't come up with this to be catchy. The old Savannah, Americus, and Montgomery was one of the predecessors to the Seaboard Airline. And they made their way across the state with power like this. That's a locomotive, isn't it? It's called the Okmulgee. Back before, when steam locomotives would get their own name, this is one of the rivers that runs through the region. Very cool 1889 Baldwin product. But these days, before the Genesee and Wyoming takeover, the Hog, the short line, was powered with locomotives like this. This is the paint scheme of the last independent short line operator before the Genesee and Wyoming took over. A nice scheme. And you can see Heart of Georgia there on the side. And this is the last locomotive that hasn't been dipped in orange. If you're a short line fan, you know what I mean by that. Genesee, Wyoming is pretty quick to repaint their locomotives. For whatever reason, this one has been held out. This is a 1965 Jeep 35, but it's been rebuilt, so it's probably really more like a Jeep 38-2. But it's still got the 35 body. You don't see a lot of those anymore. This one started on the N&W, probably as a high nose, right? And then went to the Norfolk Southern, and then it had some short line service. It worked for the Ogeechee Railroad over in Sylvania, Georgia for a while, the Georgia Midland, before it got picked up by the Hog. These days, though, this is the power you'll see on both Hog freights and SAM short line passenger trains. This is classic Genesee and Wyoming power in southwest Georgia. They have bought up every Jeep 38 on the used market, I think, and they all live in Georgia. What I mean is, anytime you're a rail fan in southwest Georgia, this is what you're seeing. And for an old Southern Railway guy like me, I think it's fun because most of these are old Southern Railway units that went on to the NS, and then NS has sold them off, of course. You notice on the NS, you never see, well, you hardly ever see BB power anymore, right? They've just really offloaded almost all the 4-axle power, and Genesee and Wyoming has been happy to pick it up. All right, but enough about that. Sam Short Line, here's the route. Starts in Cordele over on the interstate and goes all the way west through Leslie, Americus and out to planes and archery. It's a really nice run and well worth your time and just a whole lot of fun. Sam Shortline's been around for a number of years. One of the ways you can tell that is an old brochure has Jimmy on the front and he's looking pretty great. So you know that's at least a 20-year-old photo. Good for him. I'm going to tell you why in a second. Jimmy's featured prominently. The Sam Shortline's been proud of Jimmy and Rosalind for reasons you'll see in just a minute. But these are some materials from probably about 15, 20 years ago. Here's the depot. It's not really a depot. It's a storefront that the the tourist line rather, uses as an anchor point in downtown Cordele, where most of the trains used to leave from. They now leave just outside of town from a state park that I'll show you in a second. But Cordele, as Dutch mentioned a minute ago, is an incredible railroad town and worth a stop. This is the brand new Cordele Railfan Park. You heard me right, Railfan Park. The city of Cordele spent the money, they probably got some help from the state of Georgia, and they built this really lovely railfan train watching platform and a parking lot, and they have a nice set of placards with the history of Central Georgia railroading. Very cool. Why this spot? Because Cordele is a rare triple crossing. 2 main lines and a short line all cross each other at Cordele, Georgia. It is a happening place. I would not want to be the CSX or NS dispatcher in charge of Cordele because it's a lot to manage. Here's what it's looking like. The CSX, the old Atlanta, Birmingham, and Coast Main, which came up through the Seaboard system, now a heavy CSX line that kind of crisscrosses the state of Georgia, northwest to southeast, is running across the middle. The NS, the old Georgia Southern and Florida Main, that was a part of the Southern Railway down to Jacksonville, cuts through the other way of the shot, and then the Hog, the old Seaboard airline, crosses there on the third angle. And so it's a cool place to watch trains. There's always a lot going on there in Cordele. And you can imagine it's a pretty impressive signaling system to keep all that straight, right? Yeah, you'll get 4 or 5 trains an hour sometimes through Cordele. Sorry?
There's a virtual railfan.
Yes, there's a virtual railfan camera there. So you don't even have to go to Cordele. Pull up virtual railfan, and Cordele is one of them. If you don't know about virtual railfan, you should. It's a whole lot of fun. It's not as good as being there, but it's pretty darn good. Late at night, you're doing something, you just want to watch some trains, pull up a virtual railfan site. All right. There's the Hog, by the way, pulling west across the triple crossing with the freight, and that amazing turn of the century water tower in the background there. So it's quite a place. That's freight traffic. Let's get back to tourist trains. Most Sam Shortline trains now leave from Veterans State Park. The state worked with the railroad to build a really nice depot-esque pavilion. And the reason they leave here is because the Hog and Sam Shortline didn't want to have to deal with that triple crossing anymore. The main lines weren't real thrilled about passengers going through that thing a couple times a day. So they talked everybody into moving the operations onto the west side of the main lines, and that's why they leave out here from the park. Here's a little platform at Leslie, Georgia, which is just a little town along the way. If you're into telephones, Leslie has a Southern Rural Telephone Museum, proving that there's a museum for everything somewhere. That's Leslie. Americus, Georgia, has 2 stations actually, and you can see this is relatively brand new. The state helped build this, a nice platform with a nice pavilion. Then you get out to Plains, Georgia. This is beyond Plains. The name just went right out of my head. Archery. This is important. It's just a wooden platform, but right across the street, take a guess? Carter's boyhood home. This is where Jimmy grew up with his brothers. And it's now part of the National Park System, and you can visit it, and Sam Shortline trains will take you right there. That's part of their calling card, Sam Shortline. They really trade on Jimmy's reputation, whether you loved him or not as a president. Heck of a nice guy. And Plains, Georgia's surprise. If you don't like Jimmy, don't go to Plains and say that out loud, because they won't be happy with you. They love him out there, and that's the stop. The stop prior, though, is much more interesting, and that is Plains, Georgia. And there's the ancient Seaboard Airline wooden depot that still stands, and it was the place where Jimmy announced his bid for the presidency, that building. So it, too, is now a part of the national park system, and they've got some cool displays in there, and it's super fun. This is where I went to also announce my bid for the presidency. You know, that joke never really lands. Nobody ever really, no. Anyway, it's a cool spot. Here's the same shot, same depot from the air with a Sam Shortline train. The locomotive's been moved from one end to the other, and they are ready to make their trip back east home. I took my wife out to Plains for the Carter's annual Christmas tree lighting. Everybody was hoping to see Jimmy. I just wanted a shot of the locomotive, and I got it. I was taken with my iPhone. That's not too bad. I've cleaned it up a little bit in Photoshop, but you know, it's okay. And I've never been very good at night photography, but again, say what you will about Genesee and Wyoming as a company, they paint a pretty locomotive, I think. The orange and black scheme is a nice one and looks good. Here's a daytime shot of a hog engine at the depot there. It's a pretty route, really gives you a taste of rural agricultural Georgia with the soybeans and the cotton and all the things that Georgia is well known for. It's a pretty ride. And you kind of meander along at 15, no more than 20 miles an hour. Probably the scenic highlight of the Sam Shortline is the Lake Blackshear crossing, where the trains inch across Lake Blackshear at about 5 miles an hour on this really impressive wooden deck trestle that probably the Seaboard Airline built, if I had to guess. I'm sure it's been rehabbed over the years. But it really is a pretty little spot, makes for great photography, and certainly one of the coolest parts about the trip. I was pleased with this picture just because I got the boats in there with front to back hog power.
So how far south is Cordele from Atlanta?
2 hours on 75, straight shot down the interstate. Easy to get to. Yep. And Lake Blackshear is just 15 minutes off the interstate. So it's all very convenient and easy to find. Do you remember 6-7 years ago when Amtrak management decided they were no longer interested in hosting private cars, and everybody kind of got in an understandable kerfuffle about that, and suddenly all these private car owners had to find a place to park their cars because Amtrak raised the rates so high that pretty much everyone wanted out. Well, Sam Shortline was the benefactor of that problem because several people parked their private cars on the Sam for about 4 years, and they made the trip out to Plains back and forth. Here's one beautiful example. A couple I've gotten to know restored this beautiful old heavyweight Pullman. It's marked for the Georgia Railroad. It never actually worked for the Georgia, but the owner had an uncle who did, and so in honor of a family member, they named this car the Deering, which was a spot on the Georgia Railroad. But even though it never was a Georgia car, it sure is a beautiful old Pullman. Here's a gorgeous Milwaukee Road car that lived on the Sam for several years called the Wisconsin. It's a long way from home. Sure looks good, though, in that gorgeous Milwaukee paint scheme. For those of you with Texas roots, there's an old Katy car that, again, has been restored. All three of these cars, private owners, and they worked out an arrangement with the Sam Shortline. Basically, I don't know the mechanics of the arrangement, but essentially, you can sell tickets in our cars if you let us keep our cars here. And I think Sam Shortline said, sounds great to us. So you can buy, higher classes of service and actually ride in these cars. And there have been a couple of others that have come and gone. But Sam Shortline particularly has made use of that arrangement. They have their own cars as well, though. Some old commuter cars from somewhere up north. They've turned into nice little excursion cars. They have a fleet of about 12 of these, and at any given time, they're using 7 or 8 of them.
Look like the Maryland cars.
I knew the lineage. I don't remember. They're nice. I mean, they're not luxury, but for tourist service, they're great. By the way, my church group, this was trip number 2, took them on the Sam, and we had a great time. But I show you this picture really to show you the inside of one of the coaches. But here are my Presbyterians. There was my flyer, the presidential flyer. Here are some of my amazing ladies posing for Jimmy. And there was my group out in Plains. Just for kicks, this is my wife, Deb. This is my daughter, Ella. That's my nephew, et cetera, et cetera. The rest of those are Presbyterians who I'm proud to serve as their pastor. So that's the Sam Short Line. Really cool operation. It's well worth your visit. And you can go out and pay homage to the Carters. All right, 2 more. How we doing? We doing okay?
We got about 10 to 15.
All right, we're gonna do a sprint through these last 2. Let me do this one quickly because I really want to make time for my last one.
Answer questions while we kind of
Great.
take everything down.
Georgia Coastal. Been around a while. I've only gotten there in the last 6 months. It is down on the coast, as the name implies, almost in Florida. You could throw a rock from Kingsland and it would land in Florida. They are rooted in Kingsland, Georgia, at this facility. It's an interesting situation in that it's sort of a community theater merged with the tourist train. Go figure, right? What that means is they get people onto their trains by doing themed trips and sort of they do a Cowboys and Indians thing where the train gets robbed. They do a pirate thing where the pirates come on board and take all the kids' booty. They do a Santa train. You know, you get the idea, right? Here's what I say about that. There was a time in my own rail fan story where I was sort of peeved about that sort of thing. It's like, oh, these stupid themed. Y'all, they don't make money off of people like us. You gotta, if you want the trains to run, you gotta figure out how to sell tickets. And if that means pirates and Indians and Santa, at this point in my life, I'm all in. You with me? That's just my opinion. You don't have to agree with me. So this is a prime example of that. So that literally is a community theater, has no railroad history as a building, but it is the base of operations for the Georgia Coastal. They're calling that building the Florida Georgia Railway Heritage Museum. That's a little bit of a mouthful. It's really not a museum. They have a couple pictures on the wall like this. But it really, what it does, it's the anchor for the passenger operation. There is one thing inside, though, that's kind of fun. The Golden Isles Model Railroad Club. They have a pretty impressive HO model railroad layout. These guys were super nice, and they ran trains for me. And if you're a model train guy, you'll enjoy that. It's a pretty nice little layout. All right, Kingsland was a spot on the Seaboard Airline on that north-south main line that we really think of when we think about the old Seaboard. But the tourist train operates not on the old Seaboard Airline, but on the St. Mary's Railroad, which has been a Georgia freight short line for at least 100 years. St. Mary's goes back at least to the turn of the century. It was built to serve industries and a port out on the coast. It was built inward to meet the Seaboard Airline at Kingsland, and it survives today, as a lot of short lines have had to do with a combination of ingenuity and sort of scrappy business sense. They have had some interesting and beautiful power over the years. My favorite in the St. Mary's roster were these pair of RS3s that they operated in the 60s and 70s to serve the paper mill in St. Mary's. And over years, the fleet has modernized as locomotives tend to do. This is the short line's base of operation in St. Mary's, where they service their locomotives and kind of keep some equipment. If you know anything about the tourist train business, you remember Iowa Pacific and how that whole enterprise exploded or imploded, depending on your point, and their equipment went all over the country. A couple pieces landed here in St. Mary's. That's a story in and of itself. These days, the St. Mary's looks like this. NS Power doing a ton of rail car storage work, the bread and butter of short lines these days, in my experience. Everybody's making a nickel off of shoring fleet rail cars. Hey, whatever it takes, and it looks like that. One little interesting thing I've got to tell you about the St. Mary's, though, is that it's the only railroad I know of that serves the submarine base. They have a 4-mile spur, and this has been true since the 60s, where they serve the United States Navy's Eastern submarine base. And I said to the brakeman I was talking to, like, you don't move submarines. I knew the answer. He said, no, but we do move a lot of stuff for the Navy. I was like, well, that's really cool, because in my experience, most military bases have gotten rid of their rail service years ago. But they still get it. And he said about 6 or 7 times a year, the St. Mary's runs out to the base. You can't see any of that trackage, of course. It's all been behind lock and key, but you can see this beautiful submarine that they buried in the ground to show the public what's going on back there. Georgia Coastal, this is probably the most scenic spot where they cross the St. Mary's River Marsh. And the Atlantic Ocean is probably 3 or 4 miles beyond that photo there. So we're definitely in coastal Georgia. Real quick, here's the Georgia Coastal. Nice little train, kind of a hodgepodge of some streamlined equipment with some homemade cars. One of my beloved Southern Railway bay windows, that's partly what took me down there, but some other equipment as well. And, you know, it's a little hodgepodgey, but it's a nice little ride. And so if you're ever down there on the coast, check them out. It's hilarious because they kind of run right through the retail district of Kingsland and St. Mary's. So rather than beautiful scenery, you get billboards. I'm convinced, by the way, the short line has made a nickel by selling their air rights, because all the way down the main line are billboards that are cantilevered out over the railroad. I'm just convinced they're making money off of that. Hey, whatever it takes. Look at this. Doom, 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 all the way down the line. I got another shot to show you in a second. They've got a nice old streamlined RPO car, which I think is kind of neat to see these days and time. And of course, a beloved Southern Bay window that, if you ignored the lettering, still looks very Southern, right? Even though they've labeled it for the short line. By the way, here are the pirates taking over the train. Whatever, your grandkids will love it. So take them down there. But it's a pretty train. And this Jeep 38 I kind of fell in love with. It's actually leased by the St. Mary's. But y'all, this is, again, you got to be a diesel lover like me, but I know many of you are. This is a 1966 straight 38. Guess when the 38 was made? First year of production, 66. This locomotive is one of the first GP38s to roll out of LaGrange, and it's still technically a 38. It's had some things added to it, but it was never made a Dash 2 as far as I can tell. It never got some of those Dash 2 upgrades. So this is kind of a rare bird, I think, in dieseldom. And not only that, it's in a fairly pretty scheme. I paid a couple extra bucks to ride in the cab, because my daddy, a lifelong rail fan, used to say the cab of the locomotive, and here we're switching to religious language, is like the Holy of Holies. Right? Can I get an amen on that? Yeah. So I paid the bucks to ride up in the cab, partly because I didn't want anything to do with the pirates. But I had a great little ride with the Georgia Coastal Railway. And like I said, she's a 38 with a lot of history. I got to tell you about this guy, our engineer. Just give me an extra minute or two. I meet this guy in the cab, super friendly, though kind of quiet. His name is Richard Long. Richard hired on with the Seaboard Airline in 1959 as an 18-year-old. Now you do the math. Richard today, this shot was taken 4 weeks ago. 84 years old, still running trains. Coolest guy I've met in a long time. Here's his pedigree. Started with the Seaboard Airline, got merged into the Coastline, got merged into the Seaboard system, got merged into CSX. He said, and I quote, "I outlived 5 railroads." And then, at the height of his status on the CSX seniority board, he switched over to Amtrak and retired from Amtrak running the Silver Meteor and the Silver Star. So this guy had quite a career, super humble. I had to drag stuff out. You know the type. They don't necessarily want to brag on themselves, but I just know he's chock-a-block full of stories, and he was great. I said, how was it running those Amtrak Genesis? He said, may I quote him? He said, "Ugliest damn locomotive I've ever seen in my life." I thought, yeah, you're an old timer, man. Of course you're going to feel that way. But just a great guy, and it was really a privilege to meet him. I got to tell you this too. When we got out to the end of the line and they started the pirate show, he sort of said, "Oh, you know, the show's kind of going on behind us there." I said, "Oh, no, Mr. Long. This is my show right here, right? This Jeep 38 and you." He kind of smiled. So it was great. Super fun. I think half the fun of our hobby are the people you meet, right? And particularly when they've got such a history. All right. Last billboard shot. Look at that. I'm telling you. All right, here's where we end. If you'll just be gracious with me on time, I got to tell you about Georgia's newest tourist train. I'm so proud of it. And I say proud of it because I've gotten to know the people who are operating it. They're not paying me a dime. I just think that they're doing a great thing, and I want you to go ride it. Extreme southern Georgia, almost at the Florida state line. It's called the Azalea Sprinter because Valdosta, Georgia's largest city in the south, is the Azalea City, right? And so that's where they get the name from it. However, the operation is not based in Valdosta, but in the tiny town of Nashville, Georgia, not Tennessee. This is the courthouse in Nashville. And here's the Sprinter as it looks today. A respectable 4 streamlined cars plus a bay window caboose. And they have turned this into a really popular operation. They have been selling out trains for 3 or 4 years now, and I'm super proud of them. This is a group of school teachers who did a employee lunch out on the train, and I just am so proud of my friend Chris, who's taking the photo, that I got a photo of him taking a photo of happy customers. Chris Parrott on the right and Jamie Cater on the left are the owners of a short line operation in Georgia. The Azalea Sprinter is a subsidiary of their freight business. Chris got started not in railroading, but working for Waffle House as a corporate manager. But like many of us in this room have loved trains all his life, he talked his friend Jamie Cater, and let's get into the railroad business. NS was wanting to get rid of some lines in Georgia. They were there at the right time with the right offer, and they've been off to the races. Let me tell you how I met Jamie. This is a picture from Madison, Georgia, up closer to Atlanta. It's a giant Georgia Pacific plywood mill. I was out rail fanning one day, getting to know the freight short line, and I'm watching them shuffle cars back and forth. And from the cab, I hear, "Hey, you want to come ride?" And I'm like, is the Pope Catholic? I'm not Catholic, but I knew enough to say that. So I come on up, super friendly engineer. He introduces himself. He said, "Yeah, my name's Chris Parrott," like the bird. And I said, "Wait a minute, isn't your name on the side of the locomotive? Cater Parrott Railnet?" He laughed. He said, yeah, I'm one of the owners. I was like, "What are you doing running the locomotive?" Not that there's anything wrong with that. It's just not common. He said, "My engineer called in sick." Thus began a beautiful friendship. Heck of a nice guy. I chased him all day long. They took me to lunch. We've been buddies ever since, and I've watched him.
That Tifton line, is that what the city of Miami operated over to get to Jacksonville South?
Yes. I think so. I'd have to go back and do a little legwork on that, but I think that's right. So there's my buddy Chris at the throttle, even though he is half owner and chief operator of the Cater Parrott Railnet in Georgia. Super great guy. Let me tell you briefly about that. They now have 4 lines in the state of Georgia, all of them ex-Norfolk Southern, 2 of them owned by the state. They started in the south on the Valdosta line that you'll see in a moment. They then picked up the line up in Madison, Georgia, which is old central of Georgia, tertiary trackage up to Athens. They picked up the line over in Barnesville that goes down to Thomaston, Georgia. And most recently, they picked up the Ogeechee Railway, which went under, and Chris picked up the lease. So they now have the old Savannah and Atlanta main line out of Sylvania, Georgia. So they're really doing some serious freight business in the state of Georgia. And Chris is good at it. He may have learned management with Waffle House. He has figured out how to run a railroad, and that's why I say I'm super proud of him. The Valdosta line looks like this. It comes out of Valdosta, which is still a pretty busy railroad town, and goes up past Moody Air Force Base to Nashville, Georgia. Then it takes a hard right and goes northeast up to the giant city of Willacoochee. Just think it's fun to say, Willacoochee, Georgia. There they are in 2021 with the inaugural run of the Azalea Sprinter passenger train. If you were to go back in time and ride that route, you'd have been in the care of the old Georgia and Florida, right? The G&F, who had high-stepping steamers like that and ran all the way from Madison, Florida in the Panhandle, meandering up through southeast Georgia all the way to Augusta. We don't have time, but if you were to study that timetable, you'd discover that it took them all night to make that trip. At the turn of the century. They had one named train called the Bonaire Special, and they even had Pullman service. Can you believe you could go from the Panhandle of Florida to Augusta, Georgia? And this was even before the golf game was a big deal in Augusta, right? On the Bonaire Special at probably a swift 25 miles an hour. But they had some great steam locomotives. But that was then, this is now, the Azalea Sprinter. turning a tourist mile across the marshes and through the cotton fields of extreme southern Georgia. Chris has picked up some nice pieces of streamline equipment. Here's an old Southern Pacific coach that looks like this on the inside. You can see that's got some Amtrak lore from the 80s and 90s, but Chris has spiffed it up, looking good. Here's a table car that started with the Santa Fe. Looks like this on the inside. Very nice situation. Warms my heart. Chris picked up out of a junkyard a Southern Railway bay window caboose, has completely tricked it out. It's air conditioned, it's got leather seats, there's a TV in there, it's got Wi-Fi. He rents this out for birthday parties. I mean, this guy doesn't play. And I'm so pleased to see a Southern Bay Railway still turning a wheel in tourist service. His most recent pickup was an Amtrak diner. You know, when Amtrak got those new Viewliner diners, all the old heritage cars got tossed off the roster. He picked one up. It looks like this today. But even more impressive than that, check this out. Really sharp. He had a carpenter come in and completely redo the interior with natural wood. And Chris, maybe it's no surprise given that he started in the restaurant business, he doesn't play around when it comes to hospitality. He's also picked up an old baggage that has an HEP generator in it, so now he's got the whole train hooked up on hotel power, and it's really, really a fine operation. Let me tell you about Motive Power really quick. Back in the day, he was leasing some switchers and such from Progress Rail. So for instance, here's an SW 1500, not the most attractive tourist train locomotive, but it did the job. But then he wound up standardizing on the Jeep 40, because he just was able to work with Progress Rail and got a lot of secondhand Jeep 40s. These are the first 4. He's now got 7, all Jeep 40s, and they have come from all over the United States. A Florida East Coast engine, New York Central, a Western Pacific, a Rio Grande. They've come through the used locomotive market, a lot of different owners, but Chris has painted them in his trademark blue, and they're looking really fine. And make for a pretty decent passenger locomotive. More recently, a nod to your former employer, NS sold him a couple of big units. These got 2 SD70s. Y'all, that's a lot of power for a short line, but he's using them to pull railcar fleets. That's what it looked like when it came to him. Look at this now. Not too shabby. Looks pretty good, doesn't it? That's his kind of...
Looking pretty good. We're just about out of time.
Yep, we are.
I want to get the group photo.
And I'm almost done.
Okay.
Just give me 2 or 3 more minutes. We okay? Yeah, thanks. But as cool as that is, this is the real star of the show if you're a diesel fan.
Oh.
Chris has picked up 2 E-units off the second-hand, really third, fourth-hand market. You may recognize this unit in that paint scheme. This was at the Tennessee Central Museum for years. They ran the heck out of it there in excursion service. Chris bought it, primed it in his blue. This is an old New York Central E8, 1953. Started with the Central, went to Penn Central, then it went to New Jersey Transit in commuter service. This was a part of the New Georgia fleet, though not the locomotive I showed you earlier in that postcard. Then it went to the Tennessee Central Railway Museum, and now it's in South Georgia. You ready for this? Now that's a pretty locomotive, I think. He's done a beautiful job. That's a scheme he came up with. It's kind of nickel-platey, has a little bit of a nickel plate feel to it, I think, but that's a beautiful locomotive. And again, if you're into diesels like I am, that's worth taking a trip down to Valdosta just to see that. He also picked up a second one out of the Iowa Pacific fiasco. This locomotive has been all over the country too, and it doesn't run. The other one runs, the first one. This one's got some mechanical issues, but she sure looks good in that Illinois Central scheme. However, it was never an IC locomotive. This locomotive started with the Burlington and then went to the CB&Q and the Burlington Northern, Nashville Eastern, Larry's Truck and Electric in Ohio, now in tourist service. So you've got old meets new in Nashville, Georgia. All right, last set of pictures. Some pictures of the Azalea Sprinter in its prime. I'm gonna scoot through these. There's my church group, another church group, birthday party my wife threw me in the caboose. That was a lot of fun. I wanted to tell you about Greg Robertson, one of the brakemen. This is what it means when you work for a short line. Not only do you pose with wizards, you handle freight during the day, And then on the weekends, you dress out in full nines and you're a legit conductor in passenger service. So that's short line business right there. Look at that. Onboard services. Greg's become a great friend. Here's my action shots, and here's where we end. This is all the Sprinter moving through south central Georgia. I like this shot. 3,000 horsepower, 2 horsepower. That's my joke for the night. Pecan groves all over South Georgia, including the Sprinter. Makes for pretty territory. Race City is where Moody Air Force Base is. Unfortunately, they're not a rail customer anymore, but this is where a lot of the Air Force's helicopter fleet is based in the east. So it's not a huge base, but pretty active. Just some photography along the way as we finish up here. Thanks for letting me go over time a little bit. A lot of cotton and soybean in South Georgia. A lot of used rail in the short line business. He's even got his own font for the safety signs on the crossings. It's a classy operation. This is one of my favorite shots right here. We'll skip the quote and finish up with some scenes at the end of the line. And there's my daughter and her former boyfriend waving to you from the cab. And that is a half dozen Georgia peaches.
Yeah.
I gave you all the websites for all those places on the sheet. Check them out. Again, I get no money back. Just want to see people on trains.